Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, we look back on some of the major stories of the 2020 election. What was the impact of disinformation on voters? What role does polling play in elections? And why did so many miss the mark? Is social media informing us or causing us further polarization? And is there any room for civility in American politics? Good evening and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Rennell Anderson-Jones, professor of law at the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law, Boyd Matheson, opinion editor for the Deseret News, and Max Roth, anchor with Fox 13. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm really looking forward to the show because we just finished a major election cycle, and so much about what happened there, what happens in our lives, is about the information we get. Where do we get it from? Is it true? Does that matter? Is there truth to all of this? So we're going to talk about all of this today. I'm just so glad to have you with us. Rennell, I want to start with you for a moment about this great phrase. It's fake news, all right? This is something we hear so much, particularly with our president of the United States. President Trump has talked about fake news a lot. Break down for just a moment, because I think the definitions are important. What do you think that even means?
Well, I think part of the problem is that it means many things, and it means different things to different people. If we're just using the definition of the two words, we of course have an English definition for the word fake, right? Not true, false. And we have a definition for news, right? Information that is on matters of public concern. And so we might think that it is the equivalent of something that's being perpetuated that's false. But the president and others sort of co-opted the term as a political matter over the course of the last 4 years and turned it into something slightly different, right? And understanding that they meant news that was biased or news that was even just unfriendly or unflattering to the president. And part of the problem that we have here is that people are using this term in both ways, right? And it can't mean both things at the same time. And so when the president and others now in the political sphere use the term, it's hard to know whether what they're accusing the press of doing is of outright lying, right? Engaging in misinformation or disinformation, or if they're accusing the press of something else, right? Having an agenda, being biased, being unflattering towards them. And I think that's problematic. I wish we didn't use the term at all. I wish we could have clean terms for each of those things and talk about disinformation more squarely and talk about media bias in its own way.
So let's get to that for just a second. And by the way, Rennell's a former reporter also, so she knows that side of the aisle as well. But Boyd, we're talking about you all a little bit too, right?
Yeah, no question. It's a big part of what is on the media in terms of what is reporting, what is truth, and are we actually getting to that versus what is going to be political. I don't think there's a politician anywhere in the world that is ever going to agree with all of the coverage that they get. There's always going to be something there, and it has become, to Rennell's point, which I think is so important, that sadly that term of fake news has become a way to dismiss anything that you don't agree with or anything that is not flattering or supportive of your position on something. And so that's part of the problem. But ultimately, I think where this conversation ultimately has to land is it's a we the people issue. We are the ones that have to be responsible for the truth. There's a lot of ways to get to it and get at it, but ultimately it does come down to individuals.
Well, and I think that it has become a couple of things. First, that using the word fake, as Rennell mentioned, makes it an accusation. It turns it into that there's an act, you're making that active step of faking something. So it's not that you got something wrong, or it's not that you differ, but that you are faking. And that's an accusation that gets at somebody's motives. Yeah. And that is really, that is a dangerous, toxic thing to just always throw out there. The other thing is that it is cheaply categorical. What it does is it just dismisses out of hand whatever somebody has said without saying why it's wrong. Just saying, oh, that's the fake news. You don't even have to address those concerns because it's all just comes, it's fruit of a rotten tree. I'm trying to impress the law professor.
Poisonous tree.
Poisonous tree. Yeah, there you go.
And I think that's really important, too, because what happens when you use those claims is it immediately stops any debate or any conversation.
Yeah.
It dismisses it. And to me, that's the most dangerous part of it. It's not so much that it's undermining the credibility of the press or an elected official. It stops the debate. It prevents us from having the crucial conversations we need to have.
So Ronell,
that's a massive concern, I think. I think it's a massive concern that we don't really foster a system of government and the press engaging in counter speech, right? In the past, before we had this fake news label, presidents had an obligation to engage in counter speech with the press, right? If the press exposed something that was unflattering or problematic, the president had to address those claims on their face, right? Had to say, here's why it's false, right? Or here's why I did what I did, or here's additional information that will sort of contribute to the marketplace of ideas and help the reader or the listener understand what truth is. And we shut down a lot of that conversation in the marketplace of ideas by just attaching this label, right? If the president is subjected to news coverage and just tweets out, this is fake news, that's the end. We, the people, aren't getting any more information. We're not getting told what aspects of it are inaccurate. We're not being told what aspects of it the president dislikes. We're not being told whatever additional information the politician on the other end of this has at their disposal. And that's really harmful to democracy. It's a real shame that we can't sort of engage in a conversation about sort of adding new information when we have a problem with information that's unpublished.
Yeah, I think it really gets to this us, them. Everything becomes us and them. You're either with me or you're not. But the ultimate test, America is always at its best when it is a country of big ideas and open, even roiling debate. And this conversation is what circumvents or cuts off that important debate. And so I think all of us would agree that it really isn't about disagreeing. We just have to disagree better. It's not about disagreeing less as a country. We just have to disagree better. And part of that requires the media. Part of it requires elected officials to step up and have real conversations. We have to remember that the First Amendment does not belong to the presidency or to an elected official, nor does it belong to the press. It belongs to the people, and we have to make sure it stays there.
So Max, I'm curious about this "we the people" idea, because it's come up in all of this conversation today too. But the information that we get as we the people largely comes through, well, all of you. Comes through you. I mean, you're great reporters too. So how do you look at that, Max? Because I know you're a trusted voice in the community, but how do you view yourself when you are that filter oftentimes between whoever these elected officials are and people like me, the voters?
It is becoming harder and harder because because as you try to adhere to the facts can become a point of contention, and that is in this COVID era and largely in the Trump era too. I've become as much a data reporter as a political reporter, just going into the hard statistics about what is happening, and yet still when you're sharing those things, you wind up with people telling you that those things are not correct, that you are pushing a point of view by saying that this is our incidence rate of COVID-19, or by saying something about what's going on in politics or with the vote right now that we're talking about. And that's tough, and people, and we live in this world where people can cloister themselves in their own opinion bubble, and so they can consume just the news they want to hear.
And I think it really comes down to both sides, both the media and the consumer, the citizens. We have to beware of this thing called instant certainty. Instant certainty is the enemy of truth, and it's the enemy of trust. And so sometimes it's the media trying to rush to get to be first in, to break the story, to break the news. And so they make some sweeping generalities or make some assumptions, or they cut corners. A lot of times it's the consumer, the citizen, who's just reading the headline and is instantly certain that this and this and this is true, when in reality it isn't. And so part of it is a we the people. We have to back off and step away from instant certainty. Part of it is the responsibility of the media to make sure. I remember when you had Bob Woodward up here on campus at the U, he said restraint always works. It works for the media, it works for politicians, and it has to work for the people as well. We have to step back.
Wow.
Yeah, you know, historically, we have really relied in modern times as a foundation of our democracy on having at least some shared truth and at least some shared truth tellers. And I think the threats that that we're talking about here really rise and fall on that problem, right? The sort of core sense that there are even foundational, basic empirical truths that we have difficulty agreeing upon, and finding sources on which we can agree. And certainly at core moments like a public health crisis, right, or a contended election, it's especially vital that we figure out how to agree upon basic empirical fact so that we can then go on to have conversations in which we disagree upon the interpretation of them or the opinions about them.
Well, Renelle, how do you think this happens? Because what you said, it seems just exactly right to me, but you add on that layer, what Boyd and Max have just said, because we have truth, as you called it, we've got facts, and then I think Max called this an opinion bubble that we all live in also. How do these three things come together so that we can finally feel like we're getting to the source of what is actual fact or truth?
Yeah, I think the social science is starting to teach us a lot about how we come to our own position on what's true, right? What we agree when we read, what we agree to believe, and what we agree to embrace as truth. And it turns out that our political identity, our sense of belonging to a group, our sense of sort of what feels right to us emotionally has a really big impact on us, a much greater impact even than empirical data has. And part of what I think we have to do here as a society is work really hard to engage in some education at a very early age about how truth is determined, right? Understanding what our limitations are, understanding what our instincts are, understanding the way that Boyd was describing about the sort of the instinct that we do have to rush to judgment and to agree with things that sit right with us and to disagree with things that don't sit right with us, and to be more careful questioners of information that we receive. And in a social media world that permits us to sort of climb inside our own silo and just reside there, to sort of have the echo chamber that agrees with everything that we think and that we pass on to other people who think similarly, it's really important that we train ourselves up to try to at least be aware of those tendencies.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And I think the other thing that goes along with being able to silo off or bubble ourselves off also is this this increased complexity that everybody is dealing with in the world right now, and in the sense that years ago, when you just had a telephone and a television with 4 stations and your local newspaper, there was only so much coming at you, whereas now you immediately know what's happening in other parts of the world, and you immediately have access to the most extreme version of those events. And human beings are, I know I have it in me, we're prone to outrage pretty quickly. And we tend to equate whatever point of view we're seeing with the most extreme form of it we're seeing. And that is something that we constantly have access to. And so we get these sides that are simply judging each other on things that years and years ago they wouldn't have been exposed to so immediately, so quickly. And that's, I think it is, that's overwhelming to everybody.
Yeah, I think Max's point is so important that we have to be able to separate the rage from the reason. And our political system has actually taught us to respond inappropriately to those negative base emotions of anger, fear, frustration. That's how most of the political world raises funds. We always call it the shampoo bottle model. You know, the bottom of your shampoo bottle used to say lather, rinse, repeat. So they'd lather people up, they get them angry, they get them frustrated. Then they allow them to rinse that off with a nice $25 contribution, then they repeat repeat. And so we've actually been conditioned to respond inappropriately. And when we respond with rage, we rarely get to reason, and we rarely get to the conversation that's going to take us anywhere that actually matters. And so we have to get out of this us versus them. And so that's a good thing for people to be thinking through. We also have to make sure that we're checking our sources. We're getting out of our own comfort zone and bubble and what gets served up to us on our social media feeds, and go to different sources and talk to people who have different opinions than we do. Thomas Jefferson said that a difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. And so we have to give other people the benefit of the doubt and not judge them because their approach to a public policy might be different than our own. That doesn't mean they're not patriotic. That doesn't mean they're not smart. It doesn't mean a host of other things. But again, we have to take control of that and start challenging ourselves first.
These are great points. I was reminding me of my own kids who like to say, the facts don't care about your feelings. But it turns out oftentimes our feelings don't care about the facts.
Yeah, that's right.
Often is the case. Rennell, maybe for just a moment, give us some more definition. You did so great on fake news. What difference between that and maybe misinformation or disinformation? Because these are different things.
Yeah, and I think Max was sort of tapping into some of these notions that in a world in which we communicate with each other, and particularly a world in which we communicate with each other with speed, right, with urgency and instantaneous communication, we're going to get some things wrong. But a big piece of the conversation here needs to be focused on efforts to deliberately get things wrong, right? To plant within our minds ideas that are false for a wide variety of reasons, right? Sometimes those are political reasons, and sometimes those are economic, commercial reasons. There are lots of folks who have incentives to spread information that isn't true, to influence elections and to get clicks. And so we're separating out active efforts to disinform from misinformation that does make its way into the marketplace of ideas with some frequency, just in the natural course of things. Anybody who has ever tried to share information as a reporter or a journalist or as a person who just is writing up something to share with other people knows that sometimes erroneous information makes its way out to other people. And so we might be misinformed without being disinformed. And the policy approaches that we take to misinformation might need to be quite different than the policy approaches that we take to active efforts to disinform.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's a very important distinction, and it's another thing that's been thrown around after this election, which is with the polling in the election, where you have one of our own Congressman, Chris Stewart from Utah here, immediately after the election talked about how the pollsters were willingly were choosing to disinform, essentially choosing to manipulate their results in order to sway opinion. And that is a heck of a thing to say, rather than, boy, they messed up and got it wrong. I mean, those are two entirely different things. We all mess up and get things wrong. It's like the fake news thing, but the other is an active attempt to distort the truth.
Yeah, so sometimes I'm wondering how this might happen, because, Boyd, it's possible for disinformation to be so broadly shared, it becomes a lot of misinformation, right? It becomes something we're all. You had to work through this with the Deseret News, even in this last race when it came to the 4th congressional district. You had to take a stand on something. Talk about that.
Yeah. So there was an ad placed by a candidate that got through the system. We have a little different standards and practices in terms of the Deseret News, in terms of what kind of political ads we would run. We don't run attack ads at the Deseret News. That's been our long-standing practice and policy. So this one had snuck through the system once it was identified, and we did what we always do, which is go back to the candidate and say, hey, if you want to do a new creative or a different ad, we're happy to do that. Because we really believe that rather than having the big battles of the attack ads, we believe that a candidate should come to us and make their case. What are you for, not what are you against? And so there was, again, some disinformation, some misinformation in terms of an ad being pulled, but it was really in the context of what we always do, do when we receive an attack ad. The fact that it had run at all was the frontline mistake. The correction was the right thing.
Can I break the rules here, Jason?
Yes.
I want to break the rules, and I want to ask a question of Ronell, because this is something that I really am curious, and I want to get your opinion. Our station assigns me the role of fact-checking negative advertising, and what I find is that when I'm doing that, we created these categories of fact, fiction, and then we had to have this third category, which we call, because alliteration is like the law in TV for some reason, fudging, which is that they're towing a line where what they're saying is not fictional, but it is distorting the truth, and that happens on. That is what a negative ad does.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is that so? So an example would be, let's say, an ad against Burgess Owens and his bankruptcies, and it says he declared bankruptcy 8 times, and blah 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 blah. And he went through 2 large bankruptcies, and there were several filings within that. Yeah, there were 8 filings, or I forget if it's 8 or 6, but anyway, but really it's 2, and how much does that matter? Is that misinformation or disinformation?
Yeah, so legally, this is a particularly tricky situation, right? Because the United States Supreme Court has been super, super concerned as a First Amendment matter about having there be governmental regulators declaring what's true or what's false, right? Particularly as to political speech. And every political advertiser, every politician and PAC has an incentive to goose the information to be as favorable or disfavorable as they can be, right? We're going to count every single meeting that was missed by a particular candidate rather than the major meetings, right? And if you use a word meeting, then you mean all of the meetings that anybody ever held and not just major votes that were missed on the House floor, let's say. Or in the example that you gave, right? Technically, if the words are accurate that a person placed that many filings with a court, it's difficult to say sort of as an on-off switch, as a binary matter, it's false or it's true. Rather, it's puffery, right? Or it's, I guess, to use your alliteration, it's fudging. And the Supreme Court, as a First Amendment matter, absolutely protects fudging, in part because they've made the sort of hard calculation that it is much better for us to be in a situation in which we counter that false speech with accurate speech than it is to be in a situation where the government is determining truth and falsehood on matters of politics and matters of policy. Now, whether the trust that the Supreme Court actually has in the wider marketplace of ideas, the notion that if you're the candidate on the other end of that fudging, whether you can actually accurately counter that information by giving all of the nuanced clarifications, I think is a real question, right? I think there's good reason to believe, for all the reasons that Boyd has described, that we make flash judgments and have our political decisions influenced by the initial big fudging and have difficulty getting into the nuance of why that fudging is closer to false than it is to true. But as a First Amendment matter, we're in a real box on this.
Yeah, it really does come back to this as you get the fudging, as you get the nuance, and a lot of the social media channels just kill nuance. There's no space for nuance on Twitter. There just isn't. And so ultimately the question comes back to so who ultimately is responsible? A couple of years ago I was actually writing an article. My column for the week was going to be about truth, and it was one of those weeks where one thing led to another, procrastination, and a few meetings cropped up, and so I told my assistant editor, just leave me a space at the bottom of the page, and that's where my article's going to go. And it got to be 5 o'clock, and he brought the proofs around for the paper, and at the bottom there was just a picture of me, and in red pen he wrote, "The truth will be written here." And he answered my question.
You should just have every publication that you write say that. That's what
right.
it should
Which
say,
is
Boyd.
traditional
Every
for
single
Boyd.
time you should just put out every issue of the Deseret News should just say that.
That's right. And so ultimately it answered my own question of who's responsible for the truth. I'm responsible for the truth. We're all responsible for the truth, both what we consume and what we put out on our social media channels, what conversations we have online.
And we're going to mess up. We are going to mess up. We're going to make mistakes. And don't trust anybody who says they don't make mistakes. Don't trust anyone who says they get everything right. I just did 2 stories in the last 2 weeks, one right after the election, where it really looked like 3 Democrats were flipping seats in Salt Lake County. The numbers looked, covering a lot of elections, looked like that's clearly the way it's going. I covered it that way the day after the election. 2 of those Republicans have won. Those seats did not flip. I was wrong, and I did a story 2 days ago explaining what was wrong, how I was wrong, why this election kind of flummoxed me, in the way that the votes came back. And I mean, that's part of what we have to do is show our flaws.
Yeah, that courageous vulnerability.
I think that what Max has described in both of sort of his last 2 comments are both really important about what we rely on journalism doing, good journalism in a democracy doing, which is basically like what they told you used to have to do, in math class in middle school, show your work, right? I don't need Max always to get it right any more than I could be counted on always to get everything right. But what I need Max to do is to tell me how he got where he got. And I think that's actually the big answer to the question about truth and falsehood and fudging in political ads, right? Really valuable to me for Max to write a story that says, look, I did the hard work as a proxy on behalf of you, the citizen, and I dug into this question. And here's the real truth. The real truth is that it's a little bit true and it's a little bit false, right? The person has filed this number of bankruptcies, and but the way that they're counting that is in these sorts of ways. And if we can be responsible media consumers, right, read all of the material that is provided to us on this, and if Max can show his work, then we meet in the middle and we come to a place where we have the best possible shot of appreciating where the truth lies and where the falsity is creeping in.
And I appreciate that, and yet at the same time, you know what happened to those stories? That fudging became a part of the negative ads. It showed up.
So helpful to this conversation today for all of us to watch this, and there's still hope in all of this for all of us.
Absolutely.
So thank you for your comments today. And thank you for watching the Hinckley Report. This show is also available as a podcast on pbsutah.org/Hinckley Report or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for being with us. See you next week.